Hello, my name's David Bruce. So I'm going to be doing a few videos relating to the American composer John Adams in the next month or so. There'll be one on orchestration and his use of the orchestra, and I'm going to do one for the London Symphony Orchestra's channel about his 1985 piece Harmonielehre. But I thought today I'd give you an overview of some of his approaches to harmony. Adams is always described as a minimalist composer, and yet his music hasn't really been minimalist since the 1980s. But quite a few of the techniques he developed in those early minimalist pieces have gone on to become an important part of his style, and it was the minimalist pioneers who influenced him first. Steve Reich and Philip Glass had developed approaches to music in which repetitive patterns slowly change over a regular pulse. Philip Glass's music in fifths, for example, takes simple melodic lines and adds notes, often one at a time, to build a longer line, and then later subtracts them one at a time as well. And we'll see later how this kind of methodical approach to lines still influences Adams today. Steve Reich tended to overlap patterns in canons, and early pieces like music for mallets, instruments, voices and organ, which Adams heard in the mid-70s, stay in one harmonic region for a long period before suddenly switching over to another. This was the approach Adams borrowed for his early piano piece Phrygian Gates. He called these mode changes gates after the effect in electronic audio where there's what he called a sudden, immediate change of state from positive to negative. And that's how he envisioned these sudden switches of mode, although in many ways they're not much more than an abrupt modulation. And following Reich's example, Phrygian Gates sticks to a rigid pre-compositional process where the tonal areas of the piece are mapped out in advance, in this case organised around a cycle of fifths. And throughout this cycle, Adams switches back and to between Lydian and Phrygian mode, which are sort of opposing light and dark in Adams's description. So it's all pre-planned and logical, there's not much space for intuitive harmonic movement here. Now, starting with shaker loops in 1978 and gradually moving through pieces like Harmonium and Harmonielehre, you start to see a more distinctive Adams approach to harmony emerging. And I think you can narrow this down to two key elements. The first is the way he finds a way to stretch out a simple triad, usually by oscillating notes within it, to give it a sense of activity or even instability. He once described this process of activating a chord rather vividly. The basic way I compose is to take a cluster of sound like a handful of paint. First of all, I give it some kind of rhythmic impetus, and then I'd let it go forward. There's a sense of a vehicle travelling forward across terrain. Here in shaker loops, for example, you can see a D major triad. First an E is added, and then the F sharp shifts back and to the G sharp, allowing the single D major chord to stretch out in time. Here's a similar example from the Chairman Dances, where the background chord is now a more dissonant, more jazzy B-flat-7 flat-5, although you could also call it E7 flat-5, that's exactly the same notes. And then the E in the tuba and the other bass instruments moves to an extremely dissonant F natural and then G natural. So you can feel there's certainly a lot of tension and activation in this effect, even though we're basically holding on one chord. That travelling through landscape feel that Adams talks about, I think partly comes from this sense of something that's both static and moving very fast at the same time. The chord, complex as it is basically static, but the movement back and to within it is fast. The second Adamsian technique that emerges in this period is modulation through the use of common tones, sometimes known as enharmonic modulation, and then oscillating between those two harmonic areas. Here, for example, is a pretty typical Adams progression, moving from an E-flat major first inversion, which again is activated by moving back and to an F, which then itself moves back and to an E minor first inversion. The held G creating the sense of continuity between the two chords. Gradually the kinds of chords Adams uses become more and more extended. Like the one we saw in Chairman Dances, they're usually triadic chords with extended notes, and just like in jazz, these extensions can usually be found by piling on thirds one on top of the other. Here's a classic jazz chord from the 1985 piece Harmonielehre, for example. It's an E-flat minor with an F minor above it, but a jazz musician would think of this as an E-flat minor 13th. It's a beautiful, hazy, mellow chord. And I don't think that jazz connection is accidental. Here's what Adam said in his book Hallelujah Junction about learning from jazz. I would slowly, laboriously inch through a recording of a tune by Miles Davis or Charlie Parker or John Coltrane, writing down the harmonies and then trying them out in different keys. I learned much more about tonal harmony from this activity than I learned from sitting in a classroom and doing exercises from a textbook. There's also a jazz connection in the use of melody, which throughout this period started becoming more and more prominent in Adams's music. In the first works like Shaker Loops, melodies aren't much more than 2 or 3 note phrases repeated over and over. But gradually in the later works you start seeing these really long lyrical lines emerging, which Adams says he found in an unusual way for a classical musician. I wrote a very, very long series of chord changes lasting nearly 10 minutes, and then I went back and wrote the melody. Of course, this is completely against all the rules for melody writing that you learn when you're a student. You're supposed to compose the melody first, and the harmony is supposed to be the result of the melodic implications. But I willfully went against this notion by writing the harmony first and then composing the melody to go with it. But this is not so strange if you think about how a great jazz performer would embellish the chord changes of a familiar song. So in my piece, even though the melody seems like the main event, in truth it's just a response to the harmony. The melodies themselves don't sound that jazzy though. Let's look at the long line that emerges immediately after that E-flat minor 13th chord in Harmonielehre. Throughout this passage in the background, the winds, harps and celeste echo that chord in repetitive minimalist arpeggios. The melody line in the horn and cellos starts out fairly solidly within E-flat minor tonality. But already we start to see the bass line undermine its stability, just like we saw in the Chairman Dances example, moving up and down to the F. So yes, the F is within the chord overall, but it's the ninth, so suddenly moving to the ninth in the bass certainly undermines things. And gradually the sense of E-flat minor is undermined more and more, with the D natural and then the D flat in the bass and other non-chordal notes emerging in the melody. The tension builds because the winds are still playing the chord even as the melody and the bass become more and more dissonant against it. It's also quite striking how angular the melody is. There's very little you'd describe as a memorable shape. There's no sense of question and answer type phrasing, and yet it has this huge roving power like some kind of sea creature trying to break free. So I'll be talking more about Harmonielehre in my video for the LSO, who are going to live stream their performance of the piece, so I'll link it below. In the years since Harmonielehre, Adams's harmonic language has become more chromatic, and one huge influence has been this book of scales and melodic patterns by Nicholas Slonimsky. Now there's another interesting jazz connection here, because although Slonimsky wasn't a jazz musician, he was a conductor very much from the classical world. But this book certainly had a big effect on a lot of jazz musicians, in particular John Coltrane. Here's what Quincy Jones said in this quite entertainingly outspoken interview for Vulture last year. Every time I used to see Coltrane, he'd have Nicholas Slonimsky's book. Everything that Coltrane ever played was in that Thesaurus. In fact, right near the front of that book, there's a 12-tone example. It's Giant Steps. Everyone thinks Coltrane wrote that. He didn't, it's Slonimsky. That started all the jazz guys improvising in 12-tone. Coltrane carried that book around till the pages fell off. So the first part of the Thesaurus deals with patterns that can be repeated at regular intervals over several octaves. Here, for example, is a pattern that's repeated going up every minor third. At the top, the pattern is played in retrograde, reversing the intervals to create a new sound on the way down. Slonimsky gave fancy names to the way he developed these patterns: interpolation, ultrapolation and infrapolation. What that basically means is adding a note that sits in between the two others or adding a note that sits outside of two others. So here are the notes C, F sharp and C. With interpolation we'll add a semitone after each note. So C, C sharp, F sharp, G, C. With ultrapolation, the semitone will rise above the second note before falling back down. So C, F sharp, C becomes C, G sharp, F sharp, D sharp, C. And finally, interpolation falls a semitone below the first note before rising to the second. So C, F sharp, C becomes C, B, F sharp, F, C. And of course you can make any number of alternatives by combining a few of these, changing the intervals, having more than 2 original notes. So you can pretty much go on forever. So it's a huge resource, and you can see in a way how that systematic approach to scalic patterns relates back to the early minimalist days, that way of adding and subtracting notes to an idea that we saw in Philip Glass's Music in Fifths. Only now the context is far more chromatic, and in fact Adams often takes these kind of manipulations a good deal further. Here's a list that Alexander Sanchez-Behar created of different kinds of manipulations in Adams's piece Naive and Sentimental Music. Extension, transposition, inversion, all kinds of ways of manipulating a pattern. You can see an example that Adams took directly from Slonimsky in his piano concerto Century Rolls. This uses the octatonic scale, or alternating tones and semitones, which is pretty common in Adams's later music. Here's the original Slonimsky pattern. And you can see that Adams uses the pattern unchanged, except for the addition of swung triplets. But as Sanchez-Behar shows, he then moves on from Slonimsky, stretching and manipulating the original pattern in various ways. It's not particularly surprising to hear that many of these manipulations are done with the help of computers. In one interview, Adams said, "I've been developing a software program over the past 3 or 4 years, and entering modes, some from Slonimsky and some of my own invention, into the program. It allows me to survey a very large structure of music and transform it instantaneously by the mode that I happen to be working with." So I haven't been able to track down specifically what he uses, although he did mention using digital performer software in one interview. I'd certainly be fascinated to see more in depth how he does this. But anyway, it's interesting to see how Adams's language has developed and changed over the years, even while many aspects have stayed the same. He does certainly seem to keep his mind open to new musical adventures, which he summarises nicely here, talking about one of his heroes, Stravinsky. That's why someone like Stravinsky is so important to me, because he had such enormous breadth, not only of culture, personal culture, but also of techniques and styles, and he continued to tutor himself right up to his very last days. I recently attended a lecture by Richard Taruskin about Stravinsky's first experiments in serial writing, and it was wonderful to see how childlike he was. He went out and bought a book on serial composition, and he did all the exercises. It's kind of remarkable that a man in his 70s would do something like that. So that interview was 15 years ago, and John Adams himself is now in his 70s, and he seems to be showing every sign of following Stravinsky's example. I think by now Adams's early works are pretty well established and hard not to like, but I'd love to hear from you in the comments what you think about some of the later pieces as the harmony gets more chromatic. Are you still excited by this music, or do these pattern manipulations sometimes end up being too many notes? So I'm really grateful to a couple of really great academic papers that helped me research this topic. I'll link them all below if you want to read more. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please do subscribe and consider helping the channel out more by supporting me on Patreon. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.